Welcome everyone to this session of the book club. And as usual, we have a significant book to discuss. And we have Sanjay Saksena, who is presenting for us for the first time. And in spite of his sore throat, he is going to give us the gem on the book Smoke and Ashes, Amitav Ghosh. Okay. Now, some time ago, I don't know,
Yes.
3 or 4 years ago, we had done the Ibis Trilogy on the book club, one by one. I mean, Sunita Shetty had presented those. And I think everyone loved those books. The other day, Sheila was saying, I wonder how many people really read the books that we discuss. And I just wanted to say here that, you know, we're fond of saying that in this book club, we don't insist that a participant has already read the book. We're quite happy if he hasn't read the book, but would like to know about the book. And I think maybe some people might be interested enough thereafter to read the book. So I just wanted to say today, in response to what Sheena was saying that day, that I find myself reading books sometimes after the session has concluded because I find it interesting. I haven't been able to make time before. So after Sheena presented Time Shelter, I started reading it and I have completed it and I loved it. I think it's a very impressive book. And after Anna presented Ambedkar by Shashi Tharoor, I'm now reading it. So I think it works, you know, it works both ways. Then I knew that Alka was going to present The Help. And since I was able to lay my hands on that book, I have read it, Alka. You know, in preparation, I have read it. So I think the attempt is on. You can sometimes lay your hands on the book, sometimes you can't. For whatever reason, you do not get round to it. But very often, you get to it afterwards. Like Runa's book also, what was it? The Garden of Evening Mists. I read it after she presented, right? So I think it's a win-win situation. You've read it before, you've read it after, you've come to know about it because of the book club. I think all three variations are excellent. Okay, so Sanjay Saksena joins us today to present Amitav Ghosh's Smoke and Ashes. Now it's all about the opium trade, you know, what the Ibis Trilogy was, the Sea of Poppies and so on. And I think when you first begin to read about it, it's so surprising because I doubt if any of us had realized, you know, the huge ramifications behind all this. So Sanjay is going to now clue us in all that. So I would invite you, Sanjay, to take over, please. And the rest of us can all mute ourselves. I think everyone has, and I shall also do so now. So it is.
So now about the book, before we start, this is a book, it's a sequel to Ibis Trilogy that you were talking about. And it's really not a book in its own right. It's just a collection of all the notes and working papers that Amitav Ghosh had accumulated over the 20 years that it took him to come out with Ibis Trilogy. So from 2005, he's been working on it. And these are notes which are put together, basically. So one problem with that is that it doesn't follow a logical sequence. You jump from one idea to another. And there are inconsistencies. Sometimes some places there is repetition. But in spite of that, it is very rewarding. It is rewarding because it tells you about a time and about a place about which you knew very little. At least people like me who have not read the earlier trilogy. So in that respect, this book is very highly recommended. Okay, now let us move on. So it's basically the focus is on opium trade in the 19th century. And the book also has shades of autobiography, a bit of family history, and Amitav Ghosh's fondness for China, particularly Guangzhou, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, which was the center of opium trafficking. It's a very comprehensive account. He brings together social, cultural, political aspects. uh, the cultivation, production, distribution. Everything that you needed to know about opium is told to you. And some of the central themes that he comes up with is that the impact on Eastern and Western India, how Eastern and Western India were shaped by the opium trade, and how that molding was different. There was a different kind of a culture that evolved in the West, and a different kind of economy and culture that evolved in the East. And he compares Calcutta and Bombay, and he tries to explain that Bombay is what it is because of the way opium trade was organized in that part, and Calcutta is what it is because of the way opium trade was organized in this part, in the eastern part. He also discusses the role uh, of opium in shaping global capitalism in the modern world, and how, particularly in the United States, people participated in the opium trade, and how much they benefited from it. And the most interesting theme that he comes up with is that opium poppy is an intelligent being, that it is capable of plotting and planning, and that it is likely to survive human beings. So we think that we can control poppy, but actually it's the other way around. We are being controlled by poppy, and ultimately opium will triumph over man. Now, you may agree with it, you may disagree with it, but this is the trajectory that he is working on. So the book, of course, was published last year by HarperCollins, which is a bit of a disadvantage, because if you go to Chat GPT and ask for a book review, you won't get one for books published after 2022. Okay, so now about the author, Amitav Ghosh, we all know him, so this is a very brief slide. Born in Calcutta, grew up in East Bengal, India, Sri Lanka, extremely well educated, some of the best institutions, Doon School, St. Stephen's, Delhi School of Economics, Oxford University. Credentials don't get much better than this. Author of several widely acclaimed books, has been translated into several languages, and received the Gyanpith Award, India's highest literary honor, and he was the first person, in the first English language writer to receive this. Son of a diplomat and a homemaker, 67 years of age, and lives in Goa. He's lived in America. He's lived in Egypt. For a couple of years, he lived in Egypt too. So he's widely traveled. He's a global person, and of course, a global celebrity, I may add. Then we come to a bit of family story, that how the Ghosh family was connected to opium. So originally they're from East Bengal, and the family came to settle in Chhapra in Bihar, okay, which is not much of a town actually. Not many people are likely to go out of their way to visit it. And that became the Ghosh family home for over 100 years. And they absorbed Bhojpuri culture, and Ghosh's father and his uncles conversed with each other in Bhojpuri, were quite comfortable with it. Amitav Ghosh's grandfather was an advocate in the district court, and as the chief business of that town was opium, he probably handled cases relating to opium, which means he was a man of means, and he must that is the family's connection to the opium industry and the opium trade. Then we have China. Now, Amitav Ghosh is very fond of China. He has a lot of empathy and admiration. And he believes that they are a great culture, never fully understood, and the contributions are never fully acknowledged. And what he finds most surprising is the lack of curiosity about China, that most educated people have very little knowledge of Chinese history or geography, which are the big towns in China, which are the geography, the history, who are the poets, who are the literary people, who are the best known artists. We really have very little idea. In a brief aside, he blames Nehru for the war without explaining quite why. But he goes on to stress that China is very much a part of our lives. And he talks of consumption of tea, of bone china cups, influences like reverse class painting, and the motifs on Gara saris, which are particularly popular among the Parsis, I understand. Banarsi saris, and the blouse that is worn by women with sari too reflects Chinese influences. So China is very close to his heart. He has a lot of affection for China, and Amitav Ghosh has spent a lot of time in China as well. So we come to the heart of the matter, opium and the empire. So opium trade was an instrument of state policy. What is meant by that is that it was actively promoted by the imperial state, by the colonial governments. And the need for this was to balance trade with China. Because what was going on was that a lot of tea was being imported from China to Europe. And the Chinese didn't have any need for whatever the Europeans had to sell. They had no interest in European products. So consequently, European countries were required to pay in bullion for the tea that they were importing. That's when they hit upon this idea of selling opium to China in lieu of tea so that the silver doesn't get drained. And so it contributed to the empire's finances, of course. About 15 to 20% of government of India revenue came from opium trade in the 19th century. Of course, the trade in opium was justified. It was not seen as anything very wrong. They thought it's just like alcohol, in which, of course, they were entirely incorrect because it's a lot more addictive. And the native regimes resisted the import of opium, but really couldn't stand up against the superior military prowess of the European nations. So China banned opium as early as 1729, but it was a ban that was never effectively enforced. So Amitav Ghosh writes that history has today come a full circle. So while China has managed to control mass addiction, Western societies are still grappling with it. So, and the white man justified trade in terms, opium trade in terms of free trade philosophy and racial weakness of Chinese. So James Matheson, a famous British merchant, had this to say, and I quote, "The Chinese are a people characterized by a marvelous degree of imbecility, avarice, conceit, and obstinacy." So if the Chinese are getting addicted, it's their fault. We're not responsible. And this would in any case happen because that's the way they are. So that was the logic. It's of course totally wrong. Then we come to opium. He goes to some length describing various kinds of opium. His opium, of course, been known to man since ancient times, and it's a very powerful medicine. Many of our painkillers, cough syrups, and aesthetics come from opium. But it's very different from other psychoactive material because it's not locally available. And because it's not locally available, social protocols for handling it haven't been developed the way they have been developed, say for toddy, which is locally available. And second, it's costly. It takes a lot of time and processing for it to become consumable. And then, of course, it is capable of adopting increasingly higher addictive forms, morphine, heroin, fentanyl, and God knows what other shapes it may take in future. And according to Amitav Ghosh, the most important difference is that opium creates its own demand. Every other trade, commerce is a balance between supply and demand. But what happens with opium is, with opioids, is that once you introduce them, the demand will be created. You don't have to bother about it. And he gives the example of OxyContin, which within a period of 12 years, it reached epidemic levels in the United States. So this is how opium differs from other substances. And then, of course, this is his favorite theme, that opium poppy is one of the most powerful beings that humans have encountered. So he describes opium poppy as a being. It's capable of agency. It is capable of plotting, planning, strategizing, and charting its future. to me, it looks a little far-fetched, but that's the theory. So it's an intelligent being, and we might think that we're controlling, but actually we're not. It's opium poppy that's controlling us. And we thought that we would spread opium poppy. It's just using humans to spread itself, to gain more and more territory, as it were. And it's a non-human entity, and its longevity far exceeds that of human. And then this is the most dramatic thing, that it's in a war with humans, and it is a war that opium is winning. And why does he say that? Amitav Ghosh points 3 or 4 reasons. He says that opium is being produced in the world today, more opium is being produced today than at any time in the past. All governments everywhere, in all geographies, their efforts have simply failed. It hasn't worked. And the criminal syndicates who have now come to control opium trade, opioids trade, have sophisticated weapons. They have plenty of resources, and in many cases, they can take on the state law agencies without any problem. Then he points to unstable societies in places like Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Burma. The state is simply too weak to be able to exercise any kind of control. Amitav Ghosh also cites another factor. There's a steep rise in the use of prescription drugs, which are being prescribed for attention deficit disorders, make the users more amenable to opioids. Okay. Then, of course, there is the internet. It's possible to place an order for whatever you want on the dark web, and it will be delivered to you. In the United States, it comes in through the US Post, you know. And then he mentions India and Pakistan, which he says you have weak and corrupt law enforcement. Pakistan particularly, and India he mentions in the case of Punjab. They're probably hand in gloves on many occasions with the smugglers. So humans are not the only agents of history. There are other people who've shaped history, and poppy is one of them. This is the idea that he keeps reinforcing. And so the big picture is that poppy first allowed global capitalism to flourish. It provided the capital that was required for modern industry, modern corporations to come up. And then these corporations will unleash climate change and degrade the environment of the earth to such an extent that mankind's survival itself will be in question. This is the thesis. This is what poppy is working towards. Okay, so that was, let's come back to the opium trade, some description of how it was organized, how it was done. So opium's was being used by Indian elites even before the British came. And it was the Dutch who actually hit upon this idea of amplifying this trade, because the Dutch had the same problem. They also had to pay for tea, and they didn't know how to pay without losing their silver. So VOC, now VOC was a company, it was the Dutch equivalent of East India Company. It had the royal charter to trade in overseas. So the VOC bought opium from Eastern India and shipped it to rulers of Southeast Asia, and obtained from them a monopoly of spice trade. So they were doing rather well for themselves. And then the British realized that, we could play the same game. It would solve our problem as well. We would have a currency to pay for the tea that we are taking from China. So the Dutch benefited greatly. The trade generated huge wealth and provided the capital for major companies like Royal Dutch Shell and BHP Billiton. And this ties up with Amitav Ghosh's earlier assertion that it was opium poppy that fueled modern capitalism, which will destroy the planet. And both Royal Dutch Shell and BHP Billiton are guilty of exploiting natural resources. Okay, in India, 1772, East India Company gets monopoly of buying opium from Bihari farmers. It was being grown in Bihar and in Malwa. Malwa is Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, Gujarat, Maharashtra, districts of these states. So in Eastern India, what happened was that Battle of Plassey, 1757, Battle of Buxar, 1764, and local resistance collapsed altogether. Power went to the colonial rulers. And so 1772, East India Company gets a monopoly, and it sets up an opium department to regulate opium production and distribution. And 500,000 hectares between Agra and Calcutta was then under poppy cultivation, million peasants involved, and they were forced to grow opium and sell it to the East India Company because nobody else was allowed to buy. And the price was set by the monopolists, by East India Company. They were the only buyers. So the opium department worked through two opium agents, one at Patna and one at Banaras. Had officers posted in various smaller towns. So there was uh, I mean, the upper echelons of the department, about the top 20 officers, were all white men. Below that were the agents, mainly Bengalis, because they alone had at that time, the education and probably connect with British to get employment there. So they were posted in various towns, and that's how all came Motihari in Bihar. So they had draconian powers, and were pathetic. They were really oppressive working conditions, strict enforcement, and a lot of surveillance, because it was presumed that the workers would be stealing opium, and they need to be carefully watched over. So two factories were established at Patna and Ghazipur in eastern UP. Now, the Patna factory closed, I think, in 1911, sometime. And Rudyard Kipling visited the Ghazipur factory, and he wrote an essay in an opium factory. And he describes the terrible working conditions there. The processing is done by hands, 10 hours a day, heavy fumes. Dwarkanath Tagore too visited the Ghazipur factory, where a number of Bengalis were employed in the clerical cadre. Rabindranath too visited. Incidentally, Dwarkanath Tagore was connected with the opium trade, and was something that Rabindranath was extremely defensive about. It was almost apologetic. So Rabindranath too the opium trade, and he was aware of his family's involvement in narcotic smuggling. So opium from Patna and Ghazipur was sent down the Ganga to Calcutta, where it was auctioned off to private bidders in the large building that now houses Hong Kong Bank in Dalhousie Square. Those of us who are familiar with Calcutta will know. And a sophisticated futures market developed in and around Dalhousie Square. So East India Company auctions off the opium to private traders. Now, private traders could be British, they could be Indians, they could be Armenians, they could be others. Okay. And these traders would ship it to Whampoa or Linton Island, which is very close to Guangzhou, and where Chinese smugglers would take over and take it inland. So you have a situation where East India Company is actually not exporting opium to China. What it is doing is that it is the private traders who are actually exporting the opium to China. Now, the trade flourished. 1840 to 1880 was the golden period, and the exports rose from 4,000 chests to something like 70, 80,000 chests. Incidentally, one chest of opium is measured in chests. One chest of opium is 63.5 kilograms, just for the record. So the idea is that the trade was booming. So among traders from India, the Parsis were the most visible. The Wadia families, Jamshedji Tatars. And the reason for that is the Parsis were free of any taboos. They could eat whatever was restrictions on them, and they could mingle freely with everybody. Towards the end of the 19th century, the Baghdadi Jews came into the picture, with the Sassoon family being the most prominent. And David Sassoon came to India at the age of 40 and quickly took control of the opium trade on the western side. So the trade is happening. There's an eastern side and there's a western side. We'll just come to that in a minute. So on the eastern side, the prominent families were Tagore, Sheel, Malik, Day, etc. And the notion that the trade was dominated by Parsis is only partly true, and this notion, because they were so visible. Because when government invited claims for reparation after the Opium War, the 162 individuals and firms filed their claims, of which less than 1/3 were Parsis. So there was a party going on and everybody was part of it. It's not just A, B, C, D. Whoever could get a part of the action was only too glad to get it. So now most Indians had no qualms about the opium trade, so we might blame the British and say what a terrible thing to do, but actually we were all happily participating. That great harm was being done to an innocent, faraway people with little concern. A few notable exceptions: Dadabhai Nauroji, Rabindranath Tagore, Gopal Krishna Gokhale, Pandita Ramabai. They raised their voice against it, and they could see that there's something wrong in this, something immoral. So then Lin Sixu, who was a very senior Chinese official, he wrote a letter to Queen Victoria, in which he complains about how much harm, how much damage the opium traders from her. Now, the fact that there was no law prohibiting sale, possession, or consumption of opium in either England or India helped the traders pretend it was just another commodity, efficient in our country. So that is, it provided some kind of a justification, or at least it enabled them to come to terms with their conscience, shall we say, if they had one. So the Chinese got fed up with all the opium that was being imported, and so the emperor, it was a king empire then, the emperor asked Lin Six, who was an incorruptible and competent civil servant, to go to Guangzhou and to fix the problem and put an end to the trade. So foreign merchants who were asked to surrender their stocks of opium, and they refused. So the stocks were seized forcibly, and, and, and the British Expeditionary Force, comprising 4,000, defeated the Chinese. The Treaty of Nanjing was signed, and China was forced to compensate foreign merchants for the opium it had released. It had to leave 4 votes for trading. Now, of the 4,000 expeditioners, more than 2,000 were Indian. So one of the War of 1840, which was forced upon China. And the point I was making is that one of the reasons why Indians are disliked in China and in Southeast Asia is because they usually were required to do the dirty work of the British in Malaysia and elsewhere. They were the police officers. They were the person that the common man interacted with, you know. So it wasn't likely to make them very popular because they were just doing the working at the behest of the colonial masters. So okay, so this is the other point about how opium shaped eastern and western regions, and how the opium trade differed in the two geographies. So a major difference in cultivation, processing, and distribution of opium. So in the Malabar region, in the eastern region, you had complete monopoly of the East India Company, as opposed to independent farmers who sold to local merchants in Malabar. And the local merchants were the communities there, Parsis, Gujaratis, Marwaris, etc., Memons, Bohras, uh, Sindhis, and they would process the opium in their small workshops. So the reason why the Western region followed a different trajectory was that in the West, the Marathas held out much longer against the British than the local rulers in the East. So consequently, what was done in the East could not be done here. And now, differences between Calcutta and Bombay, according to Amitav Ghosh, are on this account. And he says that in due course, Western trade grew over time. In 1820, the exports for Bombay were far less than that from Calcutta. They became equal in 1815, and after 1815, exports from Bombay zoomed while those from Calcutta more or less remained same. So because of the way the business was organized, there was much greater trickle-down effect. Everybody benefited from small farmers to petty money lenders to rulers of states, Indore, Bhopal, Mewar, Jaipur, Gwalior, Bikaner. They all had a stake in the international opium trade, and they were benefiting financially from it. So, and according to Amitav Ghosh, opium trade was responsible for capital accumulation in the West, which facilitated the growth of Indian industry, which is what made Bombay so different from Calcutta. Now, exposure to international commerce and trade practices gave the merchants from Western India the confidence to become ambitious. At Guangzhou, they were competing with the white man and doing quite well. So opium was responsible for capital accumulation. Parsis particularly must be mentioned in this connection again. They were competing with other races and nationalities on equal terms. They ran businesses in Guangzhou, Macau, Hong Kong, and of the 14 members of when Hong Kong Bank was formed, and of the 14 founding committee members, uh, 3 were Parsis and 1 a Baghdadi Jew. Star Ferry of Hong Kong was founded by a Parsi businessman. So they realized that they were as good as any in the world. I mean, whatever the white man could do, they could do as well. Then we come to the United States, and there's a whole large amount of space given to what Amitav Ghosh calls the Boston Brahmins. And these chapters deal with how the United States benefited. And they had the same problem, how to pay for Chinese tea. And so what they did was that they bought Turkish opium from Izmir. Izmir is a region on the coast of Turkey. And that they shipped to China. So by 1818, Americans were bringing in 1/3 of all opium consumed in China. So they were doing quite well. And they started sourcing opium from India once they realized that this could be profitable too. And they had contacts with, because of the earlier cotton trade, after the Civil War in the United States, cotton exports from America to Britain were greatly interrupted. And that's where our cotton industry grew. So several Americans worked with Hathi Singh Khubchand of Ahmedabad, is one of the brokers who's been mentioned. And
Hello.
now leading Boston families involved in opium trade, Perkins, Sturgis, Russell, Forbes, they came from the privileged class, well-educated, elite schools, best universities, UPenn, Brown, Yale, Harvard. They were really the upper crust. And they made vast fortunes. So one Mr. Hurd made $150,000 in the space of 3 years. And Joseph Coolidge, a stalwart of the opium trade, a Harvard graduate, he married Thomas Jefferson's granddaughter and was a close friend of Lord Byron. So we're looking at the top drawer, the elite. The the biggest opium trading company for decades was Russell and Company, where the stakes were held by, majority was held by the Delano brothers. And Warren Delano is a very wealthy man, was actually the grandfather of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So the Delano in the FD Roosevelt comes from there, from opium. So, and he was related to many prominent families. It's, so what the point Amitav Ghosh is trying to make is that it was the American entrepreneurs from New England, from the privileged classes who went to China, collected money, became rich, and then laid the foundations of modern American industry. So quality education and family connections were a necessary requirement for a placement in a firm in China. And uh, the Americans had the advantage that was that they designed something called the Baltimore Clipper, which was fast enough to evade warships and could sail against the wind, which would make opium trading possible throughout the year. Otherwise, you had to wait for the winds to become favorable to sail again. And so with the capital that they raised from the opium trade, they founded banks and insurance company and brought in the concept of bank deposit insurance from China. It was something that they observed in China, and they imported it wholesale into the US. And that became the bedrock of America's banking system. Railroads was another sector that benefited. John Forbes invested a lot of money in railroads, and textiles, iron manufacturing, hotels, investment banking, general blooming of the economy thanks to the funds generated by the opium trade. A lot of philanthropy as well. Universities, colleges, schools, hospital, library. The science and engineering program at Princeton, with which Einstein was associated, was developed courtesy funds provided by one J.C. Green, a retired opium trader. Columbia University's law library, thanks to opium trader A.A. Low. I'm not sure whether it's pronounced Low or Lau. I'm not sure. Shipping companies, massive mansions in Brooklyn, large land holdings. There was a huge party going on, and Americans just loved it. So while free market mythologies were used as justification for opium trade, it was really about family, class, and education in the United States. And again, American traders were not too concerned about the morality of the whole thing. And they were aware that the damage that they was causing to the Chinese people. So we have this letter written by Robert Forbes to his wife, where he says that the trade is demoralizing the minds, destroying the bodies, and draining the country of money. But there was a code of silence among the Canton returnees, so nobody discussed this very much. And and the free market ideology provided them a justification for what they were doing. Meanwhile, the China's domestic opium industry also took off, and it took off in a big way. Poppy growing accelerated after 1830. It started with Yunnan, but went to other provinces as well. By 1910, China becomes the largest opium producer in the world. Okay, which is hardly surprising. Once they decide to produce something, they don't know where to stop. And in 1920, 80% of global supply of opium is coming from China. So there's been a massive expansion of the domestic opium industry in China. Now so you have a situation where nobody's able to control opium, and everybody is benefiting from it except for the Chinese who get addicted to it, and then the consequences follow. So this is where we are. Okay, then we come to Guangzhou, which was the center of opium trade. It's 100 kilometers inland from South China Sea. It was the only place till 1840. It was the only place where foreigners were allowed to conduct business, and they had to live in an enclave outside the city where their wives and children were not allowed. And the Chinese too were not allowed to interact with them unless they were servants. And the business had to be conducted only with licensed Chinese merchants. And these businessmen had lavish lifestyles, second wives, second families, mistresses. And Guangzhou had beautiful gardens, so it attracted a lot of British plant hunters, and And Amitav Ghosh claims that several gardens in the UK were influenced by the designs of Chinese gardens. I don't know much about gardens, so I don't know what was the extent of influence, but that's what the book states. So Guangzhou, for which Amitav Ghosh has a lot of affection, he's been there many times, is a center of art, and the portrait artist won't flatter the sitter. That was peculiar to the Chinese. When asked to do so, one painter answered, "How can handsome face make when handsome face know God?" So very clear about it. Darfin village near Guangzhou is the world's largest center of reproduction art. So you can get all kinds of Monet and Picasso and Vincent van Gogh, whatever you want. It's all this is on. You can get it done. And at one point, I'm told 60% of the global supply of Western oil on canvas reproduction was coming from Darfin. Now, there have been some famous artists, one of whom exhibited in the UK and was received by the king as well. Jamshedji Tata also brought back many paintings from Guangzhou. Several were displayed in the corridors overlooking the atrium of the Taj Hotel, and many are in the possession of Prince of Wales Museum. I don't know what became of those paintings after the terrorist attack on the hotel. Probably destroyed. Sir Jamshedji Jijiboy donated rupees 1 lakh in 1857 towards founding an art school in Bombay, the JJ School of Art. Furniture was another specialty, and many of the items that you find in Indian homes have come to India from table, the dressing table, the table-mounted sewing machine, lacquered boxes, clay figurines. So again, what Amitav Ghosh had said earlier, that we never fully acknowledge the influence of China in our daily lives. The system of competitive examinations, the UPSC, the civil services, okay, this is a Chinese import. This practice had been going on in China for a very long time. And Amitav Ghosh says that above all, the cosmopolitanism of Indian middle class comes from the Parsi experience of living in Guangzhou. The ease with which Indians are able to assimilate in any non-Indian society, whether it's the US or Canada or Dubai or whatever, he says is partly on account of what the Parsi experience of living in a city like Guangzhou. Then there is some discussion of the American opioid crisis, and this is how poppy strikes back. That's what the point that's being made that opioid use of opioids spread very quickly. Sales of Purdue Pharma went from $48 million in '96 to $1.1 billion, and 30 million people in the US are estimated to be addicted, which is about more than 1% of the population. 175 Americans dying daily of overdose. That's a 2016 statistics. So the point that's being made is that Purdue Pharma managed the environment for spread of opioids, just as British merchants had got the British government to back their trade. So what Purdue Pharma did was millions of dollars were spent buying political influence. Rural doctors were brought on board. And the whole idea was that first produce the opioids and then through clever marketing, create a demand for it. So they were passed off as painkillers, but they were really addictive and they had serious consequences for many people. Now, so that's where it stops. Now, some of these areas which probably need greater explanation, and the book can be criticized, or shortcomings that I found was that excessive importance is given to the impact of opium on India. And I mean, different authors have picked out different commodities and given them huge importance: potato, sugar, cotton. Opium too is probably in that category. Remember, it was farmed only in a very limited area. If you think of undivided India spreading from Khyber Pass to Chittagong, then the area between Agra and Patna, that really doesn't amount to very much. And we are told that 500,000 hectares was under poppy cultivation. Now, 500,000 hectares is really very little land. To give you some perspective, uh, jeera farming, cumin farming in India uh, is done on 1,000,000 hectares, and nobody would describe cumin as a major crop of India. So it was a very limited operation in terms of the land of the farmers who were impacted, and in terms of um, the land that was impacted. And in the Indian context, I would imagine spices are definitely the most important commodity if you have to pick an agricultural commodity, because um, it's spices which are responsible for two of the most important, most impactful events in our civilization. Because if you think of the last 1,500 years, probably two of the most important events were probably A, the coming of Islam, and B, the colonial experience. And both of these can be traced back to spices. Arab traders brought Islam in through the spice trade, and and the Europeans came here looking for spices as well, and that led to the colonial subjugation. So spices are far more important in the Indian context than say opium. And the idea that the 1857 mutiny was caused by economic misery generated by opium seems a little doubtful to me, because I haven't come across any research, any author, and a lot of work has been done on mutiny who have blamed opium as a cause. And this biggest criticism is that if the British were really bad and they were looking to maximize revenue, then why didn't they just promote consumption of opium in India as they did with tea? Why bother about selling it in China? They had a large enough captive market. So clearly, uh, we have these questions which probably should have been asked but haven't but haven't been raised. And in some places, the narrative lacks rigor. You have sentences that begin with "it is possible that," or "the story goes that." Now, once you start a paragraph in that manner, you liberate yourself almost entirely from any need to provide evidence or facts. So we are told, for instance, that in 1880, Indian exports were sufficient to meet the needs of 13 to 14 million consumers. Now, this is supposed to be, it's made to appear dramatic, but the truth is, and this we are not told, that the total population of China then was 440 million. So the opium trade was having only a limited impact uh, if in the big picture. Uh, Now, so he's very critical of the working conditions that were prevalent in the factories of the opium department. But we need to see this. I mean, those days, working conditions for workers were bad everywhere. We're talking of a time which was before the birth of Karl Marx, and labor reform and minimum wages and Factories Act were several decades away. So working conditions were bad everywhere. And we know this from Charles Dickens' England, that they weren't having a great time there either in the factories. So, so this is, to me, it wasn't a good time to be a worker. That's about it. Now, and Amitav Ghosh doesn't really mention that what were the working conditions like in the small workshops in which opium was being processed in Malwa. I mean, and it would be difficult to believe that they were being given provident funds or compensatory days off. It seems unlikely. Uh, so, in fact, the whole thing is that while he's vehemently against the British, and justifiably in many cases, he takes a very soft line to Indians. Indians are not held accountable for for being participants in this trade and from benefiting from the miseries of China. The idea that Bombay is more cosmopolitan than Calcutta because of opium is only partly true. It's cosmopolitan because it's a port city, just as New York is more cosmopolitan than, say, Chicago or Mombasa is more cosmopolitan than Nairobi, or Shanghai is more cosmopolitan than Peking. Then at one point, Amitav Ghosh says that Naxalism and communism in Bengal happened because of the misery caused by the opium. Now, this is problematic because communism and Naxalism should have happened in the Agra and Patna region by this logic. And it's the UP and Bihar that should have been ruled for 30 years by the Communist Party. We didn't quite see that happening. So I get a feeling, and this is a personal view, I could be wrong, that perhaps tall claims are made based on inadequate evidence, shall we say. Then the idea that opium cultivation brought about misery in the eastern region is, but if you look at the situation in 1947, you find Patna and Banaras were far more developed than any of the cities in the Malwa belt, where where the opium trade was differently organized. If you look at places, I mean, Patna, Banaras, they had hospitals, medical colleges, universities, schools, municipalities, uh, electric lighting, street lights, whatever. Compare this to places like, say, Jodhpur or Bikaner or Gwalior or Indore. I'm not sure Patna and Banaras were miserable compared to these places. Then I think that's about it. And then now there's been some recent research which says that only a small percentage of Chinese were addicts, and most of them were they consumed opium, but they were not addicts. So there's this paper, China, British Imperialism and the Myth of the Opium Plague. And then James B. Mills says that the users had agency, and blaming the suppliers alone is unfair. The sense that the Chinese could have stopped consuming. I mean, they knew the harmful effects. It was pretty obvious. And so these are some of the issues which I wish Amitav Ghosh had discussed. But like I said earlier, this is really not a book. It's more a collection of notes that he had compiled while working on the Ibis Trilogy, which is why perhaps these questions have not been sharply focused. Anyway, thank you. This is where I stop, and we can go ahead with the discussion.
Sanjay, that was an excellent presentation.
Oh, thanks very much.
I read the book. You've really done a very well, research and thorough presentation of. And I agree entirely with your critique of Amitav Ghosh in terms of the content of this book and how it's just a collection of articles. There's very little archival research he has done. He's depended mainly on secondary sources and things like that. And as you say, there are constant references to the Ibis Trilogy. And one question I just wanted to ask you, I couldn't figure out. At one point, he says that the opium production was taking place in the entire northeast region, but later on he says that it was concentrated around Patna in Bihar, and that's where they then set up the factory in Ghazipur and in Patna. So I don't know why it was that eventually, what is the reason that Bihar became the center of opium cultivation? That's not clear from his notes, from his...
No, because historically, even in the pre-British days, opium was being grown in that region.
But it was all in the entire, apparently, northeast. I don't know what happened. It's a little vague, as you know, but how it came to...
Indigo also was grown there.
Yeah.
See,
why Patna became a center for opium is not clear from what he says.
Northeast is not well communicated, but Bihar and the Gangetic Plain through the rivers also has far better communication. When you say Northeast, it's a very large area, but parts of it were not easily accessible, for traders to go and come. And
can I come into the picture?
Yeah, please.
Please note that what was they started growing in the plains of Bihar and UP, etc. There were excessive products being grown. In doing so, the levels of the river become wider than anything else, and that's why it spread on.
Why not Bengal?
Listen. And by the
Bengal
time
was indigo.
By the time it comes to Bengal, It had narrowed down. This was
huh,
up in the northern Bihar and side. You had these wide, you just walk down that area and you see that the rivers suddenly tend to spread around like that. And that's where you have very wide rivers there. Doing so, what has happened that the crops, Bihar used to be the granary of India. It just disappeared because all the water was spread out. There was no water holding on to it, and we never have been able to recover from that. So please, the British with this indigo, the poppies, this jute also, they had ruined the northern parts of
Local pattern,
right,
exactly.
completely. They have ruined. And you say Bihar is a. I'm not a Bihari, but I have full sympathies for Bihar
Yes.
that they were mistreated by the British.
yeah,
And I'll go even further. If you note, there are regiments like Sikh regiment or Gurkha regiment or Maratha regiment. The Bihar regiment came into being only few years back. The UP regiment has not ever come. These were the ones who really fought the British, and the British kept them away from the army, and we have kept them from the army as well. So they have done a mind block for us that we have not been able to get out of. That Bihar is a cheap, poor country, poor part of India, etc. Or Western, Eastern UP is bad. All those are wrong issues that was built up. And there is another issue which he talks about in his other books, where groups of Indians were taken around to work in plantations all over the world. And you have them from East, from Jamaica all the way down to East Africa, etc. And that changed. People who were farmers were destroyed completely. The male is gone, the female is working there. She was not able to sing, and they became poorer and poorer rather than growing richer by an
Yes,
outer state.
yes, yes.
Okay, anyone else?
Yes,
I'm very
Number one is this whole business about opium cultivation, indigo cultivation. And in the South, all our textile weaving and stuff. You see, we tend to compare working conditions with Victorian age, industrial age in England or here, and the modern age. But what was there? I always used to ask, what was it like before the British came? Right. There is no disputing the fact that in the Middle Ages, India was the richest country. And what was it famous for? It was famous for its craft, which is textile, all kinds of other things, as well as spices, right? And this is what they exported to.
spices was not
Yeah,
spices. It
it was
was
textiles
it
and
was
jewelry, craftsmanship of all kinds, right? Now,
it was the greenery of India.
yeah, also. Acha, okay, then what happened is when the British came and they got more control, not in the first years of the British East India Company, when they started getting political control, in other words, controlling the farmers and all that. Like, for instance, I read a whole history of how when they went to the South and they found them weaving silk, and they said, oh, this is very much in demand. Chintz, printed cloth.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there was a huge demand in Europe and British because in Europe at that time, let us understand, the whole of the Western world has benefited from primarily two things: drugs and slave trade. It is the money generated from black labor, slave labor in the Americas, which funded all the European dynasties and the royal houses and their industry. And it is opium for a short while, yes, and other things from the eastern part. Now,
Indigo.
no. And indigo, that's what I'm saying. No, but you should see their practices. Before they came, people grew all of these things. They were not new. They grew, but they grew it in a sustaining manner because demand was limited to the local area. Little bit, it may have moved in India, but it was limited to the local area. And the farmers owned their land or they generated enough. It's a myth that we were always poor. We weren't. We could eat and survive and create craft. Craft is a luxury item. It happens later, after your belly is full. So before they came and started, they actually started exploiting. And how did they exploit? They went into deals. Now, here you cannot blame Indians for being less than human. See, they went into deals with the richer people. And who are the richer people? They are the money lenders. They're the people who control money and flow and trade, merchants. And they said, we want more because there is a huge demand. How do we get more? So you have a deal with maybe the ruler and all that, and you said, we will give you a part of the profits, but you force your people to grow XYZ, so much quantity. They started giving quantity targets, as a result of which, and it was a part of carrot and stick, local people may not want to put, I mean, in Bengal, there are whole stories of how they did not want to put their fields under cultivation of indigo. I mean, that was a huge black spot for the Brits. So they didn't want to. But what happens is when you do that, you upset the entire balance of growing and self-sustaining activity, economic activity. And they're taking all of it out. They're not even leaving much money with the actual growers. So you become poorer and poorer. And that is what you compare. You do not compare with industrial conditions in Europe is also bad. In fact, that is the whole point of capitalism. The growth of unbridled capitalism came with industrial growth, right? Industrialists realize that you exploit because there is demand and you create demand. And we want more and more and more.
No,
And
but
how do we
Ruda, you said not the growth came because they were able to use the lower level of citizens, people who did not have that
Correct.
education.
No,
And
there were
were,
new items, There were a lot of new items. I mean, like tobacco grew in America. And how did tobacco and cotton grow in America? Through slave industry. They couldn't have cultivated to that level without the slave labor, right? And that money all went to Europe. Europe was small. These places were vast. And they wanted more. There was more consumption there. And what did they do to our textile industry? They stopped us from manufacturing. They took the raw material of cotton in the whole of the Deccan. There was more cotton grown where it didn't have to be so much. And they took it back to US, I mean, England and all that.
Manchester.
Revolution, their cotton and woolen and textile industry all came from the raw materials that we produced. They did not allow us. As an economist, you will know a value-added product commands more in the market, not raw materials. They stopped us from value adding. Became worse. And then, of course, you got into the industrial exploitation mindset, and that is what the 20th century and Karl Marx tried to rectify. But prior to that, it was far more, none of the local rulers, even the Mughals, nobody exploited a local economic activity in the way which these
the
guys.
British did.
The British,
In
Right.
way which
British or
British
any
did.
white race. The Dutch were equally bad. They were
Oh,
equally.
even worse. Even worse.
They were in fact worse and if you talk of Indonesia and the whole of Micronesia
Exactly.
and all that, they were much worse and they were so cruel. And the French and the Belgium in Africa. I mean, the more I read of all this, I suddenly and that's why I have stopped wanting to go to Europe, because when I go to Europe, all their stuff I see and I said, shit, this is all built on our blood, sweat and tears, and the poverty of our countries, our
Oh,
country here.
no, you're very right. You're
So
very,
I get very
right.
fed up. I'm not, I don't like
And,
going there anymore.
and then
It's
they
a
are
pity.
bringing pressure about
Yeah.
us. Do not to try and do something for the climate change. Do not spend so much money. Damn it, you ruined it, and now you're
You
asking
ruined it
us to
first
take
in
it.
the first place. And this and then so-called free trade. It's a narrative they have created over the years. And don't say opium, it's wrong. You see, okay, China has a huge population, but a lot of the population is in very far-flung areas. But the population which was economically productive, they got affected in a very, very bad way. And it is not for nothing. The Chinese could foresee it long before the Opium Wars. They tried to stop it. But, what happens is there are always greedy merchants, whether local or foreign, and they do get hand in glove and they have money power. Now you realize money power is.
Who else has a comment to make?
I wanted to say something. I mean, I read the Ibis Trilogy some time back, And actually, when I read Sea of Poppies, I did not know anything about the Indian connection to the opium trade.
Okay.
It was sad. We were in Singapore for 10 years, and I used to conduct a walking tour in Chinatown and Little India,
Oh.
etc. I used to talk about the opium wars. That I
Mm.
knew, but I did not know as much in detail, probably not much at all, about the fact that the opium came from, I knew it came from India, but the fact what it's happening out here. So it was a real good eye opener for me. And that is the reason I listened to Smoke and Ashes, because I wanted to get more about that.
Mm.
So I think what Sanjay said is right. He has given a detailed, you know, a kind of a record of what happened. But again, I think what Sanjay said, he's put too much of emphasis on opium. I mean,
Right.
everything boils down to opium. Because of opium, all the ills of the world are because of opium. It could be a factor for sure. It definitely was a factor.
It's a very major.
And yeah, a major factor, true, but not the only factor.
No, no.
One thing that I did like, of course, is that he keeps calling these US pharmaceutical companies drug dealers. Your thoughts
They
on
are.
that?
Yeah.
I mean, I have now, all these all of them, it was a
Yeah.
royal charter,
Yeah,
all British Empire was a drug dealer. I
drug
mean,
dealer.
why are you going after Ecuador and Colombia
Yeah.
and whatnot and
Yeah.
all
Yeah.
that, I mean, they were the first drug
So
dealer.
now it's come back
They
to bite them
started
in the
it.
butt,
Okay, wait a
right?
minute.
They
Let me ask
started it.
Sanjay a question. Sanjay,
Yes,
they
Satish.
came to India, China, etc. Why did they go to Africa? Why wouldn't that be much easier for them to control Africa rather than places like India and China?
No, actually, Africa was probably deemed as not worth going to. The civilizations were here, the wealth was here,
Yeah.
China, India, spices were here. This
Correct.
is the rubber was here, Malaysia. So there was business to be done, there was money to be made.
Trade.
At
Trade was
that
here.
time, probably the knowledge about Africa's riches had not been unearthed quite literally. The gold and the diamond, the silver, probably.
When it happened, then they went.
Then they went. Then the mad rush. You see, quite literally a gold rush.
Yeah.
But I think that's the reason, Satish, that they focus on this side.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah, and
my
I think
guess.
probably Africa also was probably too large and too disjointed.
Yes.
There are multiple tribes, multiple things. And again, as you said, probably they had not developed their own resources yet, which China or India had. Like
They
China
had,
was
yes.
already doing things. Easier to trade with somebody who's got something to trade.
And
Yes.
the question about why did they not make opioid drug addicts out of India? See, it was also I mean, look, India was already very, very productive in so many other ways. So they didn't need to, make drug addicts of us. But China was a closed wall. They were only allowed to function out of Guangzhou, which is Canton, right? And they wanted to break that, and I mean, drug dealing is a way.
And also, I think because China, the only thing, as they said, China didn't really want anything from the British.
No, they
So
didn't.
how do you create that demand? So that is
Yeah.
the reason why they created opium.
Yes.
And that is why they had to give it to China, because they
They had
wanted
and
to
you know
return.
what?
No, I think as Sanjay has said, it's because the balance of payments in getting tea
No, no,
from
that was
China.
the prime.
So
That was,
yeah,
that was
that's
the
why.
prime thing.
Let-
See,
let-
in the
let us speak.
beginning, they paid in silver.
Runa, let
right?
us speak. Let us
Hmm.
speak. Go on, Kaveri.
No, that's what I was saying, that I think because of the balance of payments problem, because they wanted more and more tea from China, and they needing to know how to pay for it, that they thought of the opium.
And their
And
plan
I
B
think-
was develop tea in India. That was the plan B. They tried, but it took a long time. And
Yeah.
That's another interesting thing, Runa.
Yeah.
They made so much effort to develop tea.
Yes.
Correct.
In
Correct.
Bengal, in Assam, in the
Right.
Nilgiris, in Kandy Highlands, in Ceylon, in Punjab Hills, in the Himachal. Okay, they made no such effort to identify and develop regions for opium.
Yeah.
Okay,
Mm.
so probably, I'm guessing, probably opium wasn't as profitable as it's made out to be.
Right.
Otherwise,
No,
why
no,
didn't they?
it was. It was.
Or,
No,
It
it was.
was.
Because,
It was.
in
But
Singapore,
let him finish. Please let him finish.
sorry.
Go ahead. Sanjay, go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Because
so
Sanjay
no,
has researched this.
no,
huh?
this is something I don't have an answer for this, frankly.
Yeah.
That
I
why
think you're
did
raising.
why didn't they identify regions where opium could be grown if it was such a money's, and then
Right.
we don't even come across any efforts
Yeah.
somebody's trying to grow somewhere. It just didn't happen.
No, but the
So-
whole of the eastern sector practically was under
yeah.
opium. And that
Right.
was not suitable for tea or anything. Tea was only in the hills. And the other thing is opium, after all, they were directing to China because they had a balance of payments problem with China, not with anybody else.
Yeah.
And you see, what they did is initially, it came quite late, opium thing. Why? Because initially they had silver, which they mined from South America.
Yeah.
Only when the mines dried
Mine
up,
dried up.
but they really felt the lack. So that's when they thought, okay, this is a good thing and let's go on to it. So probably the requirement for opium for China was the prime factor.
Prime factor.
All the other stuff, yes, very important, but it was already there, I mean, and there was a lot of, by that time they had got into this, using the raw materials from India and creating in England and Europe and all that, and sending back to India. So balance of payments was okay.
And even
Okay.
in for as far as the opium, how profitable it was extremely profitable. In fact, in Singapore, when Sir Raffles came and actually set up Singapore, he was there for a while and then he left. He was there only for a short while. So he had put up a whole list of things which ought to be done. One of them being primary school education and lots of other things. When he came back after a few months or a year or so, his deputy had only created opium dens because that is where the money was coming. The
Okay.
amount of opium dens which are there in Singapore, and Singapore was so tiny.
Mhm.
It was full of that. There was no education, no nothing. Only opium dens were given licenses. That's it. So it was definitely very profitable.
Mhm.
No
Okay,
two ways
Opium
about
fair
it.
enough. I
opium
take
Yeah.
your point.
deal with
It must
China.
it must have been profitable. I take your point, but
Yeah.
it's still, I still don't understand, if it was all that profitable, why didn't they try to grow more of it?
Yeah.
No,
That is the
they
question.
grew
I mean,
only as
remains
much as
unanswered in
it
my
Yeah,
mind.
I think, Sanjay, you're absolutely right. The book does not cover that at all. And
No.
because he makes such a huge case for how immensely profitable opium was,
Hmm.
then it doesn't, it begs the question, then why didn't you concentrate more on it in terms of growth? You're absolutely right.
there was
There are lots of
there was
gaps in the book. I mean, we know lots of other things, but there's lots of gaps in the book.
but it was put
And
as
I think,
stock too, no? The opium stuff actually lasted very short time, some 40, 50 years, not more. After
all
that,
the more reason to grow as much of it as you can
no,
and make
they
most of it.
did, but it takes time, no? So within that period, and there were already a lot of questions being raised in the British Parliament. There have been, right-minded people who questioned it and everything, and eventually, treaties were made, and they said, okay, we will stop. They stopped slavery officially. So anyway, things like that. So
Okay.
it was a very
I have one point to make practically at the end. Do you know something like opium is making the rounds all over the country with a lot of advertisement? Which are the 5, 6 male actors who are most highly paid? And what are they most commonly seen on TV screens?
Okay,
Why?
okay.
And for
Yeah.
one minute, let me
Yeah.
finish. Small little packet of saffron or
Yeah.
thing,
Yeah.
and you say to 15 rupees for that,
Mm.
and you're taking it, and you need so many actors, so much time on the screen.
Right. Right.
And they're multiple. The first, what is the
So-called
best
pan
podcast
masala.
was
Srigandha.
bought by?
Yeah.
It was bought by,
Srigandha.
you know who? The fellow who died.
Brosnan.
No, in India. I'll tell you the name later on. So all this has been, and what happens? Would you know that little pouch of saffron? He asks, the fellow looks at you and gives you another packet from under his chair, and that is where you have your drugs. All the drugs you can think of are under his the place where he's squatted on, and that's where you have. Well, otherwise, why would they pay crores and crores of rupees advertising? पैसा कहाँ है इतना करने के लिए? For the tobacco के लिए tobacco भी नहीं. For the little this thing, cough medicine or whatever they're serving. So think of it. We in India are going to be hit quite a lot in some time or the other. Okay. Any other questions, guys? After I given you a scare, I hope you have got a scare and taken around and shout about it. You're
Pajamas already
you're
salam.
laughing, Kaveri,
No, Punjab is already succumbed.
Kaveri,
Yeah.
you're laughing. I was
Mm.
threatened because I had said this in the public meeting. Okay, go ahead.
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay, go ahead, guys. Any other questions? Tanuj, hey Tanuj, I haven't seen you there. Neither have I seen Kapila. She's too quiet. Uma, last chance for Uma, Tanuj, and Kapila. Come along. No, she doesn't have anything to say, I think. Come on.
Yeah.
Alka, anything with you?
No, nothing. I just want to say, Sanjay, fantastic presentation. It was very
Yes,
good.
very good.
I think you gave a very good, you capsulated the book very well. You kind of got all the salient points out. And I like the fact that you got out the criticisms. I think
Right.
most of the time, many of us now get so overboard with the
Right.
greatness of the book that we don't point out the flaws. And every book has flaws. I mean,
Yes.
big or
Yes,
small,
yes.
whatever they be. So that I really liked. And it made me
Oh,
also
thanks
think
very
that, oh,
much.
yes, I didn't think of this. I didn't think of that. So it was
Yeah.
a good thing. Thanks a lot.
Absolutely.
Very nice.
Thank you.
Thank you for the
Mo-
kind
Mo,
words.
take
I'm
over.
glad you liked it. Yeah.
Anyway,
Hmm.
so Sanjay, thank you very much. I thought it was a very comprehensive presentation. You know, you included everything that Amitav Ghosh, not this, the big diary that's open on the chair. You included everything that Amitav Ghosh has said. As Alka said, you gave us a critical reading. So you pointed out the disadvantages of his form of writing and so on. I think the book is a huge learning experience. I doubt if any of us had ever realized, you know, the extent of the effect of this opium trading. I mean, we all knew it happened, but how pernicious and how ugly, I mean, just straightforward ugly the whole thing was, he brings out. What I found interesting when I was reading the book is that Amitav Ghosh has this very easygoing, patient, calm way of writing. And when he's talking about something that has been so ugly, you know, I found it a bit of a contrast, which was interesting. So, Sanjay, thank you. You must have spent quite a lot of time reading it and summarizing it in the way that you did, because it was a good analytical reading and presentation. So thank you very much. It was not a superficial summation of the content, you know. It was much more than that. Thank you very much. We hope to have you make more presentations in the future. So do look out for
Yes,
a
yes.
book
A
that
bit of
you...
a challenge for me because my knowledge of technology is less than zero, and I generally have to call my son-in-law, my daughter, to help me with it. But I will definitely contribute.
Yes,
Shall we
no,
say?
those are superficial problems which we can solve because one of us here can do it, you know.
Okay.
So
Great.
thank you very much. And thank you everyone who came and who participated and who thought and who learned. You know, I'm one of those who absolutely learned from this, totally. No, can't hear you, Satish. He's asking, no, can't hear you. So now what do we have in the future? So on the, please note, we had 4 meetings this month. Okay, that's way more than planned, but how lovely that this happened. Now, February, 11th of February, we have The Help. I like the book, by the way, Alka. I enjoyed it thoroughly.
Yeah.
And how many areas of discussion it throws open, you know. Then March. So in March, yeah, I think yes, Shanti has asked for a later date. Therefore, I will be doing on the 10th of March lessons in chemistry, which is happening as a serial, I gather, on Apple TV, I think. I saw the first couple of episodes when we were in New York, but we don't have Apple TV here. So I have not been. Does anyone here have Apple TV? Are you?
Yes, it is on
you
Apple.
You
It
are
is on.
watching. Excellent. Great. We should get it, I think. All right. So 10th of March will be me. Then 24th of March will be Runa doing The Elegance of the Hedgehog. And April, April, we're going to have another author. Michelle Mendonça Bambawale has written a book called Becoming Goan. And just like Devika Rege, you know, is having all these road shows all over the place right now, so is Michelle. So I'm hoping that we can catch her in Pune in April. And it is looking very likely that it will happen. So we're very likely to have her coming and talking about her book.
So will that be an in-person thing, Moini?
Ah, I don't think so, but
Don't think
let's
so.
see.
Okay. Okay.
You know, that also depends a lot on Chetan and Sunita, whether they can give that space and whether they can
Space
rig
again.
it. You know, it depends on them also. And I think
Okay.
they're terribly busy right now or traveling or something. Okay, so that's the scenario that's up ahead. I think looking very rosy, don't you? I think it's looking lovely, absolutely lovely. Now, the month of May, we thought we'd break for summer, as it were. You know, most people travel at that time and we come back in June. So those of you who have some ideas for sessions from June onwards, please do tell me what you would like to
Will
present.
do. Will do. Will do.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And
Great
Thank you,
bye-bye.
discussion.
Sanjay. Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
everybody.
Thanks,
Thank
Sanjay.
you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Happy
Moini.
Thanks for your
Bye.
time. Thank you.
Bye.
All best.
So
Bye.
much learning.